Okay, cool. I think we will get started. Thank you everybody for coming to our first session of Marxism Festival. I'm Faiza, I'll be your chair for the meeting. I'm from Bristol Socialist Workers' Party and Socialist Workers' Student Society. And our meeting today is on Don't Touch My Hair, Women, Race and Class by Nadia. Nadia is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, also a national organizer and a part of the membership team. Not only that, she wrote an article on the legacies of BLM in last summer's edition of the International Socialism Journal and is a contributing writer on our new pamphlet on smashing sexism, which will also have its own book launch on Sunday, but free for you guys to get throughout the weekend. So I think we will get started. Yeah, cool.
Brilliant, thank you, Faiza. And a massive welcome everyone to Marxism Festival 2023. Really looking forward to chatting with people over the next couple of days of the festival. And a big thanks for joining this discussion on Don't Touch My Hair, Women, Race and Class. I suppose the place to start is that we've seen actually a serious number of examples, even just in the last few years, of how, the violence and inequality of society can be quite multifaceted for people. You think about Child Q, a young Black girl strip searched by male police officers at her school. Her experience came out of both the racism of the involved police officers, as well as their sexism, humiliating her in the process of their, supposed search, which had amounted to nothing. Or you think about the increasing volume of harassment that Muslim women are facing both in schools and in the streets, something that's come out of Islamophobia having been a constant in society for the last 20 years at least. Rather than the hijab being something that inherently oppresses women, I think it's the other way around. It's the obsession Islamophobia has fostered around the hijab that has put Muslim women on the sharp end of racist and sexist violence and abuse. And to be honest, there's more to say on the ways in which people can simultaneously experience racism and sexism, really. To continue with the example of Muslim women, while it can be accepted that women should be able to wear whatever they want, although to be honest, even that is quite limited, all this goes out of the window when it comes to Muslim women, whether it's wearing the hijab, the niqab, the abaya, or what have you. In other words, racism creates an exception when it comes to Muslim women. And the same can be said when it comes to Black people as well. I mean, to touch anyone's hair is considered inappropriate, invasive, and more. Yet when it comes to Afro hair, this doesn't apply, as it's seen as out of the norm, and so on. But actually, this is something that goes a lot deeper than individual encounters between people or whatever. Both Afro hair and the hijab have been deemed in some workplaces and schools to be either inappropriate, not neat, distracting, and whatever else. Just to give two examples, and if we can move to the next slide. Just to give two examples. One, I want to talk about Pimlico Academy in South London. Too far. Yeah, I want to talk about Pimlico Academy in South London. This was a school that tried to implement a uniform policy, saying that hair and also headdress that was too big or too colourful was not school uniform, something that in one go targets both Afro hair and the way students decide to wear their headscarves. And actually, the pictures behind me show the inspiring walkout and resistance from students that it provoked. People protesting on their campus and things like that. And actually, beyond just protesting this uniform policy, it actually, now you can move to the next slide, it actually started to raise wider questions of the racism and the issues in the school itself, as the graffiti shows. But I want to say as well, I mean, this kind of thing doesn't just happen in white majority countries. A similar student protest was held in Pretoria High in South Africa in 2016, after students were absolutely done with the policing of Afro hair as not neat and messy, and the pressures they had to come into school with straightened hair and so on in order to abide by the school uniform. If we can move to the next slide. Behind me actually is a picture of one of the lead students, Zuleika Patel, who led the protests at Pretoria High against the school's uniform policies and so on. Continuing with Pretoria High itself, I mean, this incident demonstrates both the reach of racist ideas around what professionality, neatness, or whatever else looks like, but also specifically to Pretoria High, you know, the lingering impact of colonialism and so on, both of which leave no room for Black people to come as they are and natural or whatever. So it's these experiences really where the title of this meeting comes from, Don't Touch My Hair, Women, Race and Class. Hair, to be honest, is really a touch point in a wider discussion about how people can simultaneously experience multiple different oppressions. If you can move to the next slide. Now, I mean, we can continue with the examples, but the point really that I want to make here is that it's a reality that different oppressions don't exist in isolation from one another. And the rise of ideas around intersectionality, I think, is a really positive step in, you know, showing that people are really trying to attempt to understand and challenge the way that people can experience multiple different oppressions and the way oppressions relate to one another and so on. Now, because intersectionality has been a widely accepted framework in understanding women, race and class, amongst other things, this is something I'm going to have a focus on throughout much of this meeting. But to start with, I mean, on intersectionality itself, I mean, the coining of the term is one that is attributed to the US legal scholar and activist Kimberly Crenshaw. Crenshaw uses the analogy of a traffic intersection to describe the experience of multiple oppressions in her 1989 article, Demarginalizing the Intersection Between Race and Sex. And in that article, Crenshaw describes how Black women can experience racial discrimination similar to Black men, can face sexism in similar ways to white women, but also can experience discrimination specifically as Black women. Now, despite being credited with the term, actually, you know, the concept has actually far deeper historical origins. And if we can move to the next slide here. From, you know, Angela Davis, Claudia Jones in the late 1930s till her death in 1964, and going as far back as abolitionists and women's rights campaigners like Sojourner Truth from the 1850s to 1880s, there is actually a really long tradition of activists and thinkers grappling with and challenging the way both racism and sexism affect people's lives. Something that's been added to by the last 5 decades, in the last 5 decades by Black feminists as well. And actually, for the likes of Claudia Jones and Angela Davis, you know, both came from a Marxist perspective, and for both, class was a serious consideration that went alongside understanding oppression as well. Now, considering there is already a meeting at Marxism Festival on Claudia Jones, which I definitely encourage people to go to, I'll be drawing from Angela Davis a lot in this meeting, and in particular, her phenomenal work, next slide, Women, Race and Class, which we will also have at the front here. I mean, within the book, Davis goes through a serious examination of the experience of Black women, both in terms of the continuities and changes in terms of their experience of both oppression and exploitation, from slavery all the way up until the time of her writing that book in the early 1980s. For now, though, I do want to go back to the framework of intersectionality itself. Because the concept bears its real roots in the Black feminism of the 1970s and 80s, something which came out of the frustration of Black women who are being marginalized both in the movements for women's rights and in the civil rights and later Black Power movements. Some sections of both movements, I want to clarify, not the movements in their entirety, some sections of those movements. Since then, since the 70s and 80s, you know, is something that's been built upon by a number of activists and writers as a way of understanding the different experiences people can have of oppression, including Kimberly Crenshaw, who I started with. Now, despite all of this, approaches based on intersectionality have proven to have some limitations. Amongst them is that it can reduce people to a sum of their different oppressions and so on, something which actually intersectional theorists and so on, you know, they speak against and attempt not to do, considering actually this is a framework that came out of wanting to make movements more inclusive. Nonetheless, though, intersectionality as a framework can turn people into a sum of their different advantages and disadvantages, you know, privileges and penalties and so on. Now, of course, as I said before, we should understand the specific ways people can experience, for example, sexism or racism or both. But when this is the only thing that informs our strategies, it can pose a danger in the struggle against any oppression, really, because actually when the focus primarily is put on differences and completely at the expense of highlighting common and shared interests, the danger it poses is actually making movements smaller, more inward looking, and even more fragmented. And actually, in Women, Race and Class, Angela Davis celebrates the way in which early movements for equality saw themselves as actually fighting for liberation for all. In particular, she discusses the initially the movement for the abolition of slavery and how it was interconnected with the struggle for women's rights. Because within the fight to end slavery, women, both black and white, first becoming politically active in that fight, they were actually finding themselves struggling to be taken seriously by the establishment, taken seriously in comparison to their male counterparts and so on. And so saw the need to simultaneously struggle against their oppression as women as well. And this is actually what birthed the beginnings of the women's rights movement in the US. And the struggle for equal rights in general, something which culminated in the American Equal Rights Association, which had at its head people like Frederick Douglass, the former slave, and Lucretia Mott, both of whom were abolitionists and both of whom were big women's rights advocates at the time. And actually, to be honest, the involvement in both struggles for women's rights and Black liberation and so on, this wasn't something that was just limited to the founders of the Equal Rights Association either. Many Black women from Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, the last two of which having been slaves themselves, were also involved in both struggles too. So Angela Davis, celebrates in Women, Race and Class this initial period of unity and interconnectedness between the struggles and how it kind of fostered, a vision of liberation for all and so on. Unfortunately, though, this unity would eventually be fractured as the movements stalled when they began accepting competition between the fight for women's rights and the rights of Black people. And actually, this was something that played right into the hands of the two ruling parties as well. On the one side, you had the Republican Party, representative of the Northern capitalist industrial capitalist class. They were willing to back suffrage for Black people simply in order to win, the 2 million plus votes in mostly in the South and so on. It wasn't at all about Black liberation, which, to be honest, they failed, and this wasn't, an accident at all to address in the northern cities and what have you. On the other side of that, you had the Democrats, the party that represented the dispossessed slave owners, who are willing to champion women's suffrage at the expense of Black people and actually immigrants as well, arguing that women should have the right to vote as mothers and wives of the Anglo-Saxon race, like literally their words, rather than being the equals of men. So the support of the Democrats behind the right of women to vote, I mean, this was evidently not just racist, but actually reinforced sexist ideas as well. And as for the movements for both Black and women's equality, as they diverge, the experience of Black women was completely increasingly being left out of both agendas, although they were still under pressure to choose between the two camps. Now, considering, the high point of the struggle for both Black and women's equality in the 19th century was in the early stages when the two movements were interconnected and fed into one another, I think it shows that actually unity is possible and movements can be far more effective when they have the broadest vision of liberation for all. More than that, though, the history that I've just gone through around the fragmentation of the two movements later on, it shows that it only really suits the state and the ruling classes to see liberation movements reduced to special interest groups and so on. This is something they can work with because it's a framework where different groups can be in competition with one another rather than actually uniting against those with real power and so on. And that's why, to be honest, it's crucial for struggles for liberation to be linked to a wider framework of challenging the system that oppression is structured into as well. The capitalist system, which all oppressions as well as exploitation are completely rooted in. thanks. This, I think, is what makes possible unity and also the broadest vision of liberation for all, something which is absolutely threatening to the ruling classes who'd rather see those they oppress splintering and competing with one another rather than uniting against themselves as a common enemy. Now, having said all of that, of course, we know that there is no automatic unity of oppressed people. You look at the way in France, Muslim women are alienated, French feminists alienate Muslim women, for example, on questions of the hijab and so on. While those, like I was talking about at the start, while those feminists would defend a woman's bodily autonomy and the right for her to choose what she wears, what she does, all of it goes out of the window when it comes to Muslim women. And of course, this is wrong, and we have to argue against it, as a lot of our comrades in France do. But I think we also need to ask, does the mistake of those feminists and so on, does it, on the hijab, does it come from things like unconscious bias or privilege, or does it actually come from the political ideas people have, something that isn't inherent to your identity, but actually shaped by much wider forces and so on? I would say it's the second thing, because first of all, I mean, to not be oppressed isn't a privilege, but a right. But more than that, at the end of the day, so long as some women can be told what to wear or what to do or whatever, the right of us all to dress and do as we please is also under threat. So really, we have a much bigger, we need to have a much bigger vision, bigger and inclusive vision for liberation from that. And that's what I think a lot of those feminists in France can be won to and actually have an interest in. Now, I want to come to the second limitation of intersectionality. Often in attempting to understand the relation to one another of different oppressions, it only goes as far as people's individual experiences and can often stop there, rather than the wider nature of these oppressions and the function that they have in society. In other words, it can elevate individual experiences to explain the totality of oppression. I think, though, it is worth saying not everybody uses intersectionality in this way. Angela Davis talks about the intersectionality of struggles as opposed to the intersection of oppression in people's individual experiences and so on. So I think that's an important thing to point out. Nonetheless, though, other uses of intersectionality, like that which elevates the experience of individuals to be the overarching thing that explains and understands oppression, rather than understanding that, but looking beyond it as well as to the function oppression has in society. I mean, this can often overlap with privilege theory and so on. But that overlap, does go a lot further too. For example, white women and black men can sometimes be seen as the most privileged members in their oppressed groups. In other words, they are oppressed, but they are not as oppressed as, other people within their groups, whether it's people oppressed by racism or sexism or what have you. With this, I mean, firstly, it reduces oppression to being something that comes out of individual power relations, rather than something that goes much deeper and is structured into the system we live in. But secondly, though, I think this misses the point of how racism has always been gendered and operated through gendered stereotypes. How on the one hand, black women can be hypersexualized and simultaneously treated as shouty or angry, and on the other, black men treated as violent and predatory. For example, in Women, Race and Class, if we can go to the next slide, Angela Davis draws out how between 1930 and 1967, of the 455 executions on the basis of rape convictions, 405 were of black men. Now, of course, some of those convictions would have really been for rape or sexual assault, but a large proportion would have been weaponized charges on the basis of racism and so on. And actually, at this time, there was a serious movement from women's rights campaigns and so on about the inefficiency of police to actually deal with questions of rape and so on. Something that actually, when you look at those statistics of the 455, you can see how actually this is something that treats it as something that is an issue with black people or what have you. You think about, for example, on the question of a lot of these charges being weaponized charges on the basis of racism. You think about the case of Emmett Till and the many other black men like him who were lynched because of being accused of so much as looking at a white woman. It shows that racism towards all black women and men operated through gendered prisons. Like I said, Black men were seen as predators towards specifically white women. And actually, when it came to rape of Black women by white men, this was something that was dismissed. This was something that was often dismissed as something that was a result of Black women's natural promiscuity and so on. So to repeat, you can see how actually racism towards all has always operated through gendered prisms. And actually, this has been the case throughout racism's history as well, to operate through gendered stereotypes and what have you. You think about the British Empire in India. Can we skip forward to 2 slides on? Yeah. You think about the British Empire in India. Indian men, as the poster behind, the propaganda poster behind me shows, Indian men were seen as sexual threats to British women and so on. This poster in particular is a poster that was produced after the 1857 Indian Sepoy Rebellion. And to be honest, it's something that we continue to see today. Muslim men are treated as extremists, perverted and predatory towards young girls in particular, while Muslim women are treated as submissive and what have you, submissive and obedient to those men. Racism has always operated through gendered stereotypes and prisms. Now, to go back to the case of the lynchings that would happen in America throughout the 20th century, of course, they were based on incredibly racist ideas, but also very machoistic ideas as well. The idea of the Southern Belle, was one that saw white women as delicate, helpless, and in need of big, brave men to defend their chastity and purity. This is an absolutely patronizing and degrading way to see women, denying them their own agency and choice. And actually, it must be said that when white women did want to have relations with Black men, they would actually be treated quite severely for it as well. I think too, you see this when it comes to the battle over women's fertility, to be honest, something that the state and the right wing always seek to control. You think about the scare stories about how migrants are outbreeding true Europeans and so on. It's used to feed on pressure on usually white women or the people who are seen as true European or what have you, to reproduce and have more children. Something that goes hand in hand when we're thinking about the rolling back of hard-won gains and so on, something that can go hand in hand with the attacks on things like abortion and contraception and what have you. On the one hand, we see that, but the flip side of that is actually how, things like mass sterilization being used against Black, Latinx and working class women have also been used, whether it's from the time of eugenics to more recent scandals and so on. So, for example, from 1997 to 2010, 1,400 women in California prisons, which we know actually not just here in the UK, but certainly in the States, prisons are, have large proportions of Black, South American and people of minority backgrounds and so on. Anyway, between 1997 and 2010, 1,400 women in California prisons were forcibly sterilized on the basis of bad parenting or bad genes or what have you. More recently, it was revealed that women in ICE centers, that being the immigration and customs enforcement offices in the US, the immigration centers in the US, it recently had come out that they were actually being sterilized without their consent, with horror stories like women reporting that they'd woken up from surgeries with fallopian tubes removed and so on. All of these examples, I think, highlight how on the one hand, Black and minority women have faced preventions throughout history till now in being able to reproduce and so on. But, white women are put under pressure to have more children in order to not be outbreeded by the undesirable elements of the population and what have you. In both instances, all women are denied the right to control their own fertility and bodies. And you can see how actually racism can absolutely entrench this. And that's been the case since eugenics till the examples I went up to today. So like I said before, to not be oppressed isn't a privilege, but it's a right. You can move on to the next slide. Don't really want a propaganda face to sit in behind me for the rest of this. So like I said before, to not be oppressed isn't a privilege, but a right. And so I reject the idea that there can be more privileged people within oppressed groups from others. So in understanding people's specific experiences of oppression, while these things are important in order to address the needs and the specific needs and barriers people can face because of them, really what I'm trying to spell out is these things on their own are not enough, nor can it deal with the totality of oppression. Actually, we need to look to understand the function of oppression and how and why it's actually structured into society and the system we live in. And for us as Marxists, I mean, oppression is not something that is natural or inescapable, but actually something that emerges in specific social and historical conditions. Sexism, for example, is the oldest oppression as it emerged with the first class societies in order to allow for often men to work and produce and for women to look after the home and the family and so on. But that doesn't mean that sexism has stayed the same. It's something that especially today, takes a very particular form under capitalism. And you can see a similar thing with racism, really. It's something that has constantly shifted and changed in order to fit the ruling class agenda of the time. Unlike sexism, though, which, like I said, is the oldest and in many ways most entrenched form of oppression, racism was something that was an invention of capitalism in order to justify the transatlantic slave trade, then empire, and now used to divide and rule and scapegoat migrants and other groups, as well as, justify all kinds of abhorrent imperialist policy and what have you. Both sexism and racism, like all other oppressions, in very specific ways come out of, in very specific ways and coming out of very specific historical and social circumstances, have the function of upholding the capitalist system, which has at its heart the exploitation of the vast majority of people by a tiny minority of people. And actually in locating the roots of oppression in the capitalist system, i.e. that it hasn't always existed and therefore will not inevitably always exist. It actually makes us as Marxists the most optimistic that we can end oppression. But that is actually something that is rooted in taking on the system that births and reinforces things like racism, sexism, and so on. But how is it that we do that? And I want to start concluding by drawing out the last limitation of intersectionality, and that's that it treats class as another ism, something that I think is a fatal mistake when we're talking about, lasting liberation, because actually class is what gives us power to actually end oppression. And to go through this, I just want to make a few points. First, while race and gender are constructs, things that are materialized in people's experiences of racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and so on, class is something that comes from a material relationship. No matter how you see yourself or others see you, you're either somebody who sells your labor in order to sustain yourself, or you buy the labor of others in order to create your wealth and so on. This is the central antagonism that is at the heart of capitalism. Class is something that comes out of exploitation. You're either somebody who exploits or you're part of the vast majority who are exploited. In other words, it's an economic relationship rather than not an identity, and an economic relationship that's based on conflict, even when that conflict isn't out in the open. Now, of course, class oppression does exist, for example, the prejudices towards people with strong regional accents or whatever, but class is, primarily an economic relationship based on exploitation, where profits are extracted from the unpaid work of the masses of people. But this is where capitalism's vulnerability comes from as well, though. Workers, which include women, Black people, transgender people, and so on, workers are the ones who produce the profits that keep capitalism going. When they stop, the system can't function and comes to a standstill. That same system has racism, sexism, and all oppressions embedded into it in order to maintain itself. This is why we talk about class. It gives us power not just to challenge and end exploitation, but to challenge and end all oppressions as well. And to be honest, it's a misconception that Marxists see class as more important than everything else. We don't. And actually, especially for us in the SWP, we absolutely do not see class as necessarily more important than everything else. You think about all the different meetings that are happening at Marxism Festival on racism, sexism, LGBT oppression, and so on, exploring the different aspects of these oppressions and how they affect people. Actually, we take oppression incredibly seriously. For us, these things tie together because oppression oppression upholds class antagonisms, the class antagonisms are at the heart of capitalism that allow for a minority to rule and enjoy real privilege over the vast majority of us. In other words, capitalism needs oppression because by oppressing some of us, it's better able to exploit us all. This means for working class people, whether they experience racism, sexism, transphobia or not, it is in their interest to actually fight back against all of these things. Now, having said that, it's not automatic that when workers fight back, that sexism and racism and whatever else are rolled back. That's of course not the case. In the last year, we've seen the biggest number of strikes for the last 3 decades. Yet those have not automatically wiped away, divisions created by racism and sexism and so on. We have to fight in the here and now to overcome those divisions, as well as win changes that make real differences in people's lives in the here and now. But what I'm saying is that actually we can win more than just reforms and changes that are constantly under threat. We can actually end oppression for good. And for us, what that means is entailing the radicalism and energy of movements like Me Too, the Black Lives Matter and so on, with the power of the organised working class. It's combining these struggles with the power of the organised working class and the radicalism that they have. The force that Marx described as the gravediggers of capitalism. This is what gives us the best conditions to challenge oppression in a lasting way and take on the racist, sexist, capitalist state and the people it serves. This is what we think it takes to win fundamental change and liberation for all.
Thank you so much for that, Nadia. Very insightful. I am going to give you guys a couple of minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and then I'll bring you all in for a general discussion. Cool.
Hi, my name's Jane. I'm from Hackney SWP, and I was until I retired a teacher in Hackney. And before I talk about Child Q, which I did want to say something about, we also had a case in the school in Hackney 2 or 3 years ago where a girl was like systematically barred from going to school for 6-8 months because she had an afro. And it was an absolute disgrace because, people can't see at the front of the classroom. I mean, please, it was appalling the way she was treated. But specifically about Child Q, I don't know how many people have ever actually read that report. It's very, very painful reading, actually, because of the way it goes through how badly the senior staff at school behaved. But the whole way in which that girl was a young black working class girl from a local estate was treated and stigmatized from the start. Okay, she may or may not have had cannabis. I don't really care. It's a safeguarding issue. It's not police that involve, in a school. It's not an issue that involves the police. Yet she was dragged out on the assumption that black working class girls smoke dope, etc., etc. And then you go through the report. She was also told a few days before, and this does relate to structural racism, that actually if she didn't sort of get her act together and stop doing this, she might be excluded. And there is a huge issue in British schools around black students in particular, but also special needs students, Gypsy Roma students being excluded from school on all sorts of dubious pretexts. And then the whole issue around her having a period and obviously the strip search itself. It was absolutely, it was completely and utterly horrific. And every time I read it, I just shudder because it's so awful. But I think a couple of other things. First of all, I had, nobody's meant to know the name of the school, though practically everybody does. I was not surprised which school it was. As soon as I heard about it, I thought it would be that school, because it was a school that treats its staff like shit, actually, and it treats the students like that. Massive top-down, so-called zero behaviour tolerance problems, kick students out and exclude them rather than look after them and think about any problems or issues or whatever they may have and all the rest of it. It actually goes to the education system that brings in the police, and there's been huge numbers of reports about, strip searches since, but also actually wants students to be utterly battered down by a curriculum and by everything else, But, and the last thing, I'll finish on that, is actually, despite all that, the level of protest was absolutely brilliant. Students walked out at school, they were black, they were white, they were boys, they were girls, etc., etc. And I think we saw that. Nadia talked about the Pimlico instance earlier, but also in the last few months, we've had students all over the country doing things like girls saying, you're not going to have male staff measuring the lengths of my skirt. And, you know, I could go through the list, but I'm sure people have read about it. So, you know, I think it's a lot of growing resistance among students, and good for them. You know, that's speaking as a teacher, but you know what I mean? I think we absolutely need to encourage that. And by the way, link it up with the current strike wave, because actually when you do go on those picket lines, they are mixed, they're black and white, and lots of our students and parents support us.
Thank you very much. To the comrade in the yellow top, but also feel free to put your hand up whenever. I'm keeping an eye out. Cool.
It just take me a few seconds, basically. I'm just sort of Googling the internet, and I'll just read out this one paragraph. William Cuffey: there can only be one candidate for a memorial to Chartism's leaders. William Cuffey, born in Chatham in 1788. Cuffey trained as a tailor and lived most of his life in Westminster. By the 1840s, he became the chief leader of the Chartists in London, and nationally, he was black, the son of a freed slave.
To the comrade back there wearing pink, followed by comrade in front row wearing white. So, cheers.
Yes, I noticed child Q came up again, and to be fair, I did read that report. In fact, I was forced to read that report by my employer, and I'm a different sector. I'm health and social care. And the alarming things about that was, if my management behaved like the school, like the education, we'd be investigated by the CQC. If I behaved like the police officers, I would having to be seriously answering to my management about why I did it, what best interests I was going through, and would probably face in the sack, if not CQC in prison. Why are our police getting away with this now? But the biggest thing that I've come across is about all of this. I'm a trans female Jew, and I'm in 100% in common with you. There is no difference. We're all oppressed. Thank you.
Cheers.
And the SWP.
Comrade at the front, if you want to stick up your hand. Yeah, cheers.
Thanks. My name's Sheila McGregor, and I'm from Tower Hamlets Socialist Workers Party. And thanks very much to Nadia and the previous contributions. There's one thing that I wanted to come back to, and that is why we are obsessed with the question of class struggle and the question of oppression. Because I want to start really with the Tory cabinet. Because I read, when I read the report on the sexism and homophobia and racism in the police, the recent one, I went and looked at what Suhela Braverman had to say about the launch of that report and what she said at the Tory party conference. And she quite deliberately, like Nadia kind of hinted at, she actually pointed the finger at Pakistani men as being having a key problem with integration inside society. And she has done absolutely the same again. She started her contribution about the report in the House of Commons with praise for the police, and only at the very end could she bring herself to say, well, actually, rape and murder of women by the police is not really the done thing. So we have her in the cabinet who pursues an out and out racist policy. And the contradiction is, of course, that she will have suffered from racism, and undoubtedly does suffer from racism and from sexism, and yet she weaponizes both as part of, because she is a Tory, she's a right-wing Tory, she's got an eye on becoming the leader of the Tory party, I think, and is therefore weaponizing racism and women's oppression as systematically to try to, as part of the drive back of the unity which is coming out of the current struggle at the moment. And that is, and I think that is really, really important, that actually which class you belong to shapes also your oppression. So the most oppressed inside the workers' movement, inside the working class movement, are precisely Black women, LGBT, Muslim women, single parent women, in terms of housing, in terms of length of life, in terms of illness, in terms of every single way that you cut it, the oppression is sharpest because it is sharpened by being part of the working class movement. But that also has and it works the opposite way around as part of the ruling class, that being part of the ruling class can help you to ameliorate I mean, that woman who just resigned from Thames Water, how many billion? I mean, she was recruited with 1.5 million golden hello, I think. Well, thank you very much. You know, your sexism, and you can live with that too, can't you, if you like that? But actually, the important thing, I think, for us is this notion that the consequences of the contradiction inside capitalism, of the constant drive of the ruling class to accumulate and attack our side, means that in the end we fight back. It's taken a long time in coming in terms of the development of the pay struggles, but what it does, it pushes all of us, regardless of whether we're black or we're white or we're LGBT or women or whatever, to begin to unite and to begin to resist. And one of the marvelous things I think, I'll finish with this sentence, on the picket lines has been the extent to which there's been a real spirit of anti-sexism, anti-racism and anti-homophobia. And I think that comes out of the Me Too, the Black Lives Matter and the LGBT pride movements actually reflected inside the workers' movements, and we need more of it.
Thank you very much for that contribution. I haven't seen any more hands up. Oh, hi, yes, right at the front. Yes.
Hi, I'm Adishri and I'm currently studying at LSE. I'm also hoping to pose a question if you don't mind. So I was currently reading Amia Srinivasan's The Right to Sex, and in that she raises a very interesting point that there was a time when Black men were wrongly, accused of sexual harassment of white women. And at that very same point, Black women were being sexually harassed by Black men. And they were held in a big dilemma, because if they did raise that point, that would be like going against their own class, their own workers' movement. And if they did not, that's going against their own, So like it's very interesting to see when you mentioned the idea of how women had to choose between the two camps of like racism and sexism. I think the whole question of class becomes more important here. So like I would really like to hear what you have to say on that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm from Denmark and a Danish socialist, part of the sister organization IST in Denmark, and also part of Say No to Racism, a small branch also in Denmark. We have some discussions with the people who are engaging with these ideas and have a very large focus on intersectionality, microaggressions, and a lot of the other stuff that you also listed. And it's hard to pull people over to a socialist cause, and we are having trouble engaging with them, because there's also sort of a mistrust, I feel, because some of the ideas sort of lead to this perspective that white people inherently have a benefit of also holding oppression over other races or genders. And so because we are a majority white left wing in Denmark is so small, and the socialist is we are a very small organization. We've also been criticized from Black Lives Matter, who we also work together with, for being too white. And it can be hard to kind of break out of this cycle, because we have maybe one or two persons of color in our organizations. And I was just wondering what are the strongest arguments to sort of capture the interest of a lot of these people that are generally consider themselves also left-leaning. Yeah.
Comrade on 1, 2, 3, 4, fourth row, second down with the nice shirt. Sorry.
Oh, I have a nice shirt. Well, thank you very much. I always do socialist had taste. Right. So first of all, thank you very much, Nadia. I thought that was and a very excellent introduction. Certainly the bit that I caught, I was late. My name is Jechi. I'm from Ghana, International Socialist Organization in Ghana. And I thought that Nadia's point towards the end about the centrality of class, offering a framework for understanding different oppressions, but also at the same time offering a strategy for fighting them both specifically and in an integrated way. I thought it was an important, very particularly important point, even when, even in parts of the world where some of the kind of, social formations do not look exactly the same. So because one of the advantages of approaching it that way, in my mind and in my experience, is that it allows us in seeing the multiple oppressions that emanate from exploitation and class. It also allows us to understand another thing about exploitation itself, which is that there may be multiple forms of exploitation. So if you take, say, the Global South, for example, it is true that if you're thinking of exploitation simply in terms of a classical, let's say, in British working class, you get up, you go to work, you're paid a wage, and so on and so forth. First of all, you'll think class is of far lesser relevance. And if you forget about exploitation, you will forget also that whoever surplus value and profits are pumped out of constitute part of the global working classes and are constantly under pressure in any case to kind of edge towards earning a wage for a living. So you can have smallholder farmers, peasants, and so on and so forth, where within that you also have a great deal of microaggressions against women because it's the household economy and the patriarchal, the household organization of farming, for example, relying on family labor, that is so on. But once we understand exploitation, and we understand women's oppression as joining together, then we can understand, for example, that the right to land for women will be central, so that the way in which you look at women's liberation and the specific concrete demands might differ in different places, but you can navigate all that if you have the kind of, if you approach it the way in which Nadia is asking us and helping us to do. A final point, of course, is that it's not simply because I'm already a member of the international socialist tradition, but I think that just the diversity of exploitation and oppression that we've talked about implies that it is never going to be automatic, that people see class in its, in the way in which class unity ought to manifest itself, nor in any case the best way in which you can be somebody who is a fighter for, around the question of oppression in all its various dimensions. To have that integrated system change approach, I think you need a full critique of capitalism. You need to be in complete opposition to capitalism. You need to be a revolutionary socialism, and you need to be in a revolutionary organization. Join the SWP.
Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you for that brilliant lead off, Nadia. It was so good. I wanted to talk a little bit about the question of intersectionality, which is what we were talking about up the back during our 3 minutes of chat time. Because I think Kimberly Crenshaw is a really interesting starting point to think about in terms of understanding the different political positions that people can come to who see themselves as being intersectionalists or being into the question of intersectionality. Because Kimberly Crenshaw was not, when she talked about intersectionality, this was not a radical theory she was advancing. She was a legal scholar. She was looking at some very appalling legal cases of Black women being dismissed from their jobs or not being promoted, who, when they said that they were being discriminated against, the law said, well, no, you're not being discriminated against, because some dickhead boss of theirs could say, oh, well, look, we can see in our organization, it's not the case that other women have been fired, or we can say there are plenty of Black men who are in more leading positions than you that have been promoted, and therefore you do not legally face discrimination. So that's a perfectly worthy thing for someone who's a legal academic to spend their time doing, to say the laws that we currently have actually do not recognize the way discrimination really works, is that if you suffer from multiple forms of oppression, that you can be discriminated for in a more complex way than, if you just suffer from one form of oppression, if you're just a non-white person or you're just a woman in a workplace. But it's not a particularly radical argument about how to transform the world or how to fight racism. That is obviously not the case for all people who believe in intersectionality. There's a whole swathe of people, there's people who say, I believe in intersectionality, and that's why I think we need mass solidarity. That's why I support strikes. That's why I think the massive people have to come together collectively to overthrow the capitalist class. I believe in intersectionality, and that's why I'm for the working class. class, because you can see the working class is the massive society that not only do not benefit from oppression, but reflect the mass of different oppressions that this screwed up system we live in forces on us. You also meet people who say that they believe in intersectionality, who say, well, that's the reason why I think that X, Y, Z person who doesn't suffer from the form of oppression that I'm talking about, or that particularly affects me, that actually they as an individual benefit from that reality. And I think that that's an important thing to recognize, that intersectionality, when it comes down to it, is an analytical tool. And analytical tools are really important. It is important to figure out what you think about the world, how the world works, what's wrong with the world, but it's one analytical tool that looks at some of the ways that oppression works. I think personally that Marxism has always been intersectional. Like, look at the stuff that Marx wrote, the First International, talking about the oppression of the Irish and the complex social relationships between class, racism, colonialism. That as an analytical tool has always been a core part of the Marxist tradition. And obviously you've seen, some of the amazing writers and thinkers and activists that Nadia talked about, who have developed it, who have talked about it in terms of different forms of oppression, specifically the questions that relate to race and sexism and how those exist. But I think, kind of comes to the question that the comrades at the front answered. I don't think there is, although maybe Nadia will come back and be like, there definitely is. I don't think there is one thing you can say about how do you convince someone who's interested in intersectionality, how do you convince them of Marxism? Because someone who's interested in intersectionality can have a whole series of different other political beliefs or rationales that underline that or that fit into that, just in the same way that anyone who has picked up on one or other analytical tool that hasn't yet been one to a broader worldview about how the system's set up and how to transform it, I think always can.
Cheers. Thank you. So our final two contributions will be from Comrade in Pink, followed by third row, yellow shirts. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania Bed, SWB, Edinburgh. Thank you, Nadia. It is really fantastic talk. And the most important thing, I think, the title and how you link between these two things. I think many people of us, we didn't think before about how to link in between racism, sexism, and these things. I just want to speak about, if we look around us now today, the capital system is in a crisis. It is a huge economic crisis. We never see in our, I think before, this is something is totally not similar to what happened in 2008. And when this system in a crisis, what he did, they attack us. They attack people. They attack working people. They attack women. They attack refugee, and they attack these people because they want us to fight in other part, not to fight the whole system. And what is really important here, if we look around us, oppression is really increasing. What is going on in America about abortion rights, we are not so far from it, so don't feel very safe. And what we look about the refugee bills here in the UK, so these people are really fighting us. They really fighting the people that looking for better environment, better human living, better human rights. So what we can do in our side, the very thing I think which is very important, we should really organize ourselves. We should build ourselves. We should build our movement. We should make this movement really essential and really important. And don't take a break, because they didn't take a break. They attack us. They continue attacking us. We shouldn't take any break. We should continue organize. We should continue building and so on. And the most important thing, I think Nadia say about many important things, but I just want to stress this point, is how to link these struggles together. We couldn't fight in separate groups. We couldn't fight in a climate change, and then another group fight for women's rights, another group fight for refugee. No, all these systems are linked because it links to the capital system. So we should really make many things like this and connecting things together and always talk. This fight is a single fight. We should fight the capital system. We should fight the system that creating all this type of oppression.
1 minute.
This talk, you couldn't see it anywhere, but you can see it here in the Marxism Festival and in SWB. So join SW.
Hi, 1, 2, 3, yes. You mentioned France, so that gives me a good excuse to talk. I've lived in France long enough to see, in particular, the rise of Islamophobia as being really at the cutting edge of racism in France and the offensive of the ruling class to divide the majority. The general point I want, and it's not finished, I mean, it's something that comes and goes at the moment. It's an attack on the right of young Muslim women to play football wearing the hijab. There's an association called Les Hijabeuses, which we should defend. So, but the general point I want to make is that we need to understand the nature of the ruling class offensive, the reactionary offensive. It can take different forms at different moments. It's not always Islamophobia. At the moment, one of the main lines of attack in France is an attack on what they call wokeism. This comes from the far right. So you can see what this means. This means a generalized attack on all minority and oppressed groups. Anybody who defends them is the enemy. But it's only one form of the reactionary offensive. Sometimes they will, for example, apparently take the side of one oppressed group against another. You touched on this, but for example, the far right and members of the ruling class posing as champions of gay rights in order to demonize Muslims. I mean, you know, this is an absolute classic. So we need to understand how the offensive can be a very crude one. It can also be much more subtle. I will finish with an anecdote. You mentioned Angela Davis. There's a high school in Saint-Denis, just outside France, called the Angela Davis High School. Now, the name was actually chosen by the school community, by the students and the parents, but it suited the authorities actually to have an Angela Davis High School in Saint-Denis. It actually gave them an image of being, you know, progressive and tolerant and so on. Now, the authorities want to change the name of the school. They're not happy with the name. They want to call it the Rosa Parks High School. Now, why would they want to do that? Because Angela Davis has been outspoken in criticizing state Islamophobia in France. And that's why they want to change the name of the high school. Okay.
Cheers. Thank you very much for that discussion. I think that was very beneficial, and I'm sure Nads has a lot to come back in with. But yeah, no, cheers for that, everybody. I'm going to bring in Nadia for 10 minutes to come back in on what we've spoken about.
Yeah, thanks everyone, because I thought that was a really useful and interesting discussion. And I suppose I just want to kind of respond to or pick up on really 3 points. And that's the fantastic thing about Marxism Festival as well, because actually the discussions don't just need to happen in the meetings. We should carry them on in other meetings, the socials and what have you. But first, on the question that was raised on Black men raping Black women and so on, and in particular the period of history you were talking about, you know, at the same time as, you know, the lynchings and things like that, you know, the question of when it was Black women being assaulted by Black men, fearing speaking out and so on. I think, you know, the point that I would start with is that actually, and it was the case then and continues to be the case till today, rape of women in general is something that is rarely taken seriously by the ruling classes and the state. They only really care when they can weaponize it in some kind of way. They don't actually want to challenge these things at all. Actually, even in this country, we're seeing a record low of prosecutions and what have you for rape and sexual assault, even though we know that actually this is something that is on the rise. And, you know, so this is something that has been the case. This is something that has continuously been the case from the period where there was lynchings in America in the 20th century till now, you know, and I think the example around Suella Braverman was important, you know, the whole turning a blind eye to the, you know, endemic kind of abuse and sexual violence from the police, and, you know, turning instead to Pakistani men and saying that this is a problem with them and so on. Obviously, we know these experiences can be much sharper when it comes to Black women. And actually, it's sharper because their experiences are completely ignored, whether they are the victims of Black men or white men or what have you. And actually, a lot of the time, especially in the period of history you were talking about, you know, all of these things would be dismissed on the basis of, well, you know, this is to do with the natural promiscuity of Black women and so on, the hypersexualization that I spoke about, and what have you. And actually, when Black women were, I mean, you see a duality, isn't it? Because, you know, Black women being the victims of white men when it came to rape and sexual assault, you know, these were often actually men in positions of authority and so on, whether they were the police officers, the judges, or what have you. And actually, when you think about the whole question of, you know, not wanting to speak out, on the one hand, you know, perhaps there is some ideas of, you know, the experience of racism or what have you. But I also think when you face the same kind of violence from the people who are meant to protect you and so on, why would you want to go to them anyway? I mean, and actually it's a reality that continues until today. Lots of women don't want to go to the police. But something that's not stopped being a problem. Actually, they don't feel safe around the police, you know, being coerced into relationships, perhaps even facing assault from the police and what have you. And so actually, I think what we want to challenge is how the experiences of women and how, you know, the racism can put, you know, Black women and women who experience racism on the sharp end, you know, how they can be ignored, whoever they're the victims of. And actually seek to empower and support women, really. I mean, the Tories have absolutely slashed through, you know, funds and so on for shelters and things that allow women to take control of their lives and what have you. So the audacity of them to, you know, pretend like they care about violence towards women and so on. I mean, we obviously know there's serious hypocrisies in that and what have you. And I think we also need to challenge why people don't, you know, and I think things like, you know, the outrage at David Carrick, you know, things like Sarah Everard and so on, you know, these things are raising the questions as to why people don't feel safe going to the supposed bodies who are meant to protect you. Obviously for us, we don't actually see the police as a force that was really created, the police or any of the kind of structures of the state to protect people. Actually, they're there to protect law and order of a minority rather than protect people in general. And it's something I want to come back to. I did also want to talk on the point that was raised at the very start about from the comrade who's a teacher in Hackney and so on, because I think all of it, what it highlights is how education, you know, is shaped to kind of mold students to fit into a society with inequality, let alone racism and sexism. You know, education is kind of shaped to mold people to fit that kind of society and so on. And it's particularly when you look at working class schools, the ways that they're underfunded and selective and what have you, you really see that. But you can also see how actually, you know, questions of racism and sexism really come to the fore. Like, I'm really glad people, the person at the front spoke about, you know, the question of exclusions and so on and linking that with uniform policies. It's almost like it's kind of preparing them for, you know, the world around them, where actually these things are not just normalized, but embedded into wider structures and institutions and so on. But actually as well, what I really wanted to talk about, because I don't think I need to go over again the reality of what education is like, but actually in thinking about the student revolts like in Pimlico, like the students who protested against the experience of Child Q, and actually, sorry, not student revolts, like student fightbacks and protests since the examples I'd used and what have you. Those things in the last few years, I think, show a radicalized generation, in particular, a radicalized generation that has been kind of radicalized by movements like Black Lives Matter and so on, really. And I think, you know, I suppose, yeah, sometimes people can, you know, feel pessimistic about huge struggles that have massive aspirations. And there's definitely this with Black Lives Matter, oh, it didn't achieve anything or what have you. But the way it's actually transformed people's confidence to challenge racism and so on, I think actually is something to take quite seriously and something to build on. Like in my own school, I went to school in South London. There were uniform policies, very much like the example in Pimlico and so on. I went to school a couple of years before 2020. And actually, to be honest, I don't, you know, why could you see, you know, student walkouts and protests the way you have since 2020? I do think the confidence of people to challenge racism and the way it manifests, whether in their schools, in their communities and so on, has been heightened by such a mass struggle and what have you. So that's something I wanted to add to that point. The last thing I wanted to build on really is, you know, the hypocrisy of the ruling classes, to be honest, the point that was raised at the front. I'm glad, the comrade at the front brought up Suella Braverman and her comments around Pakistani men and so on, and counterposing it with the question of the police, even the stuff around, them wanting to start launching projects to take on grooming gangs that were ethnicity based and so on. All of these things I think is incredibly important because actually, it goes beyond the questions of the police. I was talking about before the fact that we're on, a record low in terms of prosecutions and convictions of rape and sexual assault and what have you. They obviously don't care about protecting women, and the state and the ruling classes obviously don't care about actually taking on these questions and so on. There's huge hypocrisies amongst them. But as well, I think you see these hypocrisies in all kinds of other examples as well, isn't it? You think about, like, for example, the war on drugs and so on, which in the US was used to kind of launch mass incarceration of African Americans and so on. And to be honest, it's not like there hasn't been a war on drugs here that targets, the poorest and often, ethnic minorities, communities and what have you. The absolute hypocrisy of all of that. And at the same time, if they really want to find drugs, they should go to the House of Commons, as those reports have shown. It shows that point about, they can talk about law and order and everyone, having to abide by law and order, but law and order is really, the law and order of the minority, who really, to be honest, are above their law, and it's about keeping the rest of us in our place and so on. And I think this is why it's right for people to talk about the way we should consider class, but also, how class actually shapes our experiences of oppression and so on, because, it's absolutely right. Of course, Suella Braverman will experience sexism or racism. Of course, Kwasi Kwarteng is going to experience racism. Of course, Kemi Badenoch may experience racism and sexism, but actually, first of all, their social position means that they can mitigate a lot of those experiences and so on. But secondly, to be honest, they have a stake in the system that is upheld by racism and sexism and so on. That's a very different position from all of us in this hall who actually have a stake in ending the system that is propped up by racism and sexism and what have you. And this is why I think class is incredibly important. And it means actually, when it comes to fighting oppression, we need to go beyond just challenging the symptoms of oppression, the way it manifests and so on, and actually take on the root of it, which is in a, okay, oh, that went fast, which is, rooted in a system that is shaped by the class antagonism at the heart of those, the minority who exploit and the majority who are exploited and so on. And that means, obviously I talked about in the introduction, connecting the radicalism and the militancy of movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, even the recent amazing protests, which I was glad to be on, against the sentencing of Carla Foster and so on. We want to combine the radicalism of those movements with the power of the organised working class. But actually, we also want to go further than that, isn't it? We see revolutionary struggle that takes on the capitalist system, the root of all of these oppressions. If we're going beyond just challenging the symptoms of it, we see revolution as actually a way of ending these things and bringing about lasting and fundamental change. If you can just move to the next slide. And this is where really I want to talk about how things transform immensely during the course of revolution, really. The Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin described revolutions as festivals of the oppressed. Really, you see all different oppressed groups come into the fore. These are Coptic Christians in Egypt in 2011. That's the obviously famous picture of Alat Saleh in Sudan and so on, come into the fore amidst revolutionary struggles, because actually, on the one hand, there's the process of, all the kind of reactionary, bigoted ideas that people are kind of fed in, day out. They begin to actually be challenged in an experience of being part of a fight back where you're confronted with who the real enemy is in society. But actually, people have the biggest aspirations as to how things can be different and so on. And like I said in the introduction, they like to paint the working class, especially here, as something that is just white, men, but actually, you know, especially when you think about the strikes and so on, it's actually much more diverse than that. It includes women, LGBT people, migrants, minorities, and so on, all of which have actually been at the forefront of fights for better pay and conditions and so on. I mean, this is why we talk about revolutionary struggles, really, because we don't, you know, it's important to make fight for gains in the here and now. Obviously, they make differences to people's lives, but actually, we don't want to keep fighting the same battles again and again and again. And actually, you know, if we're talking about true liberation and liberation for all and liberation for good, then that absolutely has to be tied to a vision of smashing a system that has oppression at the heart of it, and so on. And this is why we're revolutionary socialists. And if you're a revolutionary as well, if that's why you've come to Marxism, that is great. But don't be a revolutionary by yourself. Be a part of a revolutionary organization where you can have a bigger impact on the struggles around you and so on, drawing them to their most radical conclusions, but winning more and more people to a completely different vision of society. So I hope people join us and come and chat to us at the desk over there.